further, last but not least speaker, we have Henner Busch from Sweden, and he's going to talk about Flygskam. I hope I pronounced it correctly, or probably not.
That was pretty good.
Yes, that is the Swedish phenomenon of flight shame. So we're finally going to touch on social aspects of environment and climate change in general. So Henner, please tell about your findings and the situation, and try to be on time so we would have enough time for the panel discussion. Thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you see my presentation now. Could you quickly give me a thumbs up? Great. Okay. So as announced, I'm going to be talking about Flygskam, or the Swedish phenomenon of flight shame. And I will go a little, I start right with the presentation. And first of all, when we're talking about Flygskam, what is it we're actually talking about? Or what is it we're talking about when we are talking about flight shame? The simple translation is that, right? And it is a term that first came up in public debate in 2016. So it's something that has been around for about 5 years, but really kicked off in Swedish debate in 2018, so 3 years ago. And this is something worth noting because it is something that came up before the corona pandemic actually kicked off. Very loosely defined, Flygskam is the feeling of shame when one is flying, knowing how much emissions this mode of traveling creates. So it's about an internal feeling of shame that you're doing something that is wrong. And having this feeling coming up in people, that has a couple of preconditions. I mean, first of all, you have to have the financial means to fly, right? You can only sit on an airplane if you can afford to fly. You also have to have the legal rights to fly, meaning that a lot of people are simply because of their, for example, their nationality or their lack of ID documents or so on, exempt from flying. And then you have to have sufficient knowledge about climate change and the impacts of flying on climate change. Okay, here I have a nice definition, and I'll let you read that at your own speed. Good, and I think based on these definitions, there's a couple of things that are worth highlighting in this context. The first thing is that we are talking about an emotional reaction. Yes, it is an emotional reaction that people have when they have the feeling of shame, but at the same time, it is an emotional reaction that is built on knowledge, right? It is not only built on norms, but it is also built on knowledge about the climate and the emissions that are related to flying. We also see that this is about a specific cultural setting, specific groups in which this come up, and it is linked to this sense of people wanting to do the right thing. And I think these are important things to highlight because that will to some degree explain to us why this came up in Sweden and started spreading from Sweden. Okay. So what's the problem with flying? Very, very straightforward. Well, I mean, if you're sitting on an airplane and the airplane is flying around, we have a bunch of emissions, first of all, and most notably CO2, of course. There's a number of other gases or emissions that affect the climate. The emissions, the pure CO2 emissions, are something like 2.5% of global emissions, whereas the radioactive forcing, so basically the impact on climate change from flying, is more something like 3.5%. That is due because of the other gases, but also because of the altitude at which these emissions take place. They behave slightly differently up there than they would behave if we had those emissions down here on the ground. So we're talking about 3.5%. And you might argue, well, 3.5%, is that really such a big thing? And you could say, no, it is actually not in absolute numbers, but there's something related to flying. Why Sweden? And we get back to this question of why it's related to flying. Why Sweden? I mean, first of all, we have quite a consensus on climate change in Sweden. We have basically a decarbonized energy sector. We have fairly low per capita emissions. And flying here is a potential outlier in, if you look at the emissions, per head emissions in Sweden of citizens. And you always have in Sweden a sense of a high moral standards that we as citizens should adhere to, but also that we as a society in Sweden should adhere to. And I'll go into these points in detail in a bit. We also have quite widespread flying behavior in Sweden. So Swedish people fly a lot, and that's also one of the reasons why it came up. Okay, so climate change consensus, I'll make this quick. We see Sweden ranked here as a country where about 90% or 85% of the people, 95% of the people actually agree that climate change will have negative impacts on Sweden. We see that there's a lot of political documents. There's a Swedish climate strategy, so the climate policy framework from 2017. There's basically a political consensus that climate change is real, that it's man-made, that it's problematic, and that we should do something about it. As I said, fairly low per capita emissions if we compare Sweden to other countries. So we see Sweden here. I think these are numbers from 2000, so taken from 2020, but reporting on the year 2016, where we see that Sweden is something like 4.6, 4.5 tons of CO2 per capita per year, which is much lower, as you can see, than the EU average or the two neighboring countries of Finland and Germany. So flying as an outlier in this context, yes. Swedish people like to fly. Swedish people like to travel. This is from Aftonbladet. Aftonbladet is one of the tabloid newspapers. They have the number of 350,000 Swedish people that every year go to Thailand for holidays. This is quite a popular thing to do in winter when it's dark and depressing here, that people want to get some sun. A lot of people fly to Thailand. That is 350,000. We have a population of 10 million. So that 3.5% of the Swedish population every year go to Thailand, which I think is quite remarkable high number. Flying to Thailand, I calculated if you take a direct flight from Stockholm, Arlanda, so the biggest airport in the country, and you fly to Phuket, that would be an average 4.6 tons of CO2. And if you think back at the number that I just showed you, that corresponds to the per head emissions that the average Swedish person has every year, meaning that you would double your CO2 budget by just flying to Thailand, because these numbers don't show in the numbers that I showed you before. So we see that flying is, if you look at the individual budget, carbon budget of a Swedish citizen, is something that can really ruin your CO2 balance. Not only that, so people are flying a lot out of the country, but there's also a lot of flights within the country. These statistics are in Sweden, so that might be a bit difficult for you to see. But what we have or understand and what we have here is 7 million passengers in flights that are domestic flights within Sweden. We have 10 million inhabitants, meaning that every year, in average, a Swede flies 0.7 times within the country. The interesting thing in this context is I just took the kilometers covered by domestic flights and divided them by these numbers of passengers, which basically made me come to the solution that the average domestic flight is just 487 kilometers long. So actually a flight where a lot of people would say, well, this is something you can cover with other means of transportation. We have a good train network in the country, fast trains. Why do people fly? Good. So this is basically this whole thing. this is why people are ashamed, because they understand that if you go on a plane, you fly to Phuket, you basically you double your budget, your CO2 budget. And this is basically why flight shame is something that actually really kicked off in Sweden. It became a phenomenon in Sweden. But it has not been only an individual phenomenon, but we'll go into that. As of 2018, this whole idea of flight shame became more and more of a social movement. So there's a couple of groups that popped up that took up this topic, a couple of social media campaigns that tried to keep people on the ground and not fly. The biggest in this context is Vi håller oss på jorden, which basically is called Staying on the Ground, which basically started having the so-called Flygfritt campaigns, or the flight-free campaigns for 2019, 2020, 2021, where people were invited to join this campaign and make the commitment that they're not going to fly for an entire year. We have certain spin-offs of that. So, for example, Stay Grounded is a network that tries to focus on organizations. It started off as something that was within academia that tried to make sure that academics don't fly, or try to reduce the numbers of academics flying, but now spread out to other kinds of organizations as well. One thing that's very important to highlight in this context is that this idea, this concept of flight shame is not flight shaming, meaning it refers to an internal struggle that you have as an individual passenger. It is not the process of calling out other people who fly a lot and then say shaming these people for their behavior. This is something that, of course, happens as well, but it is not where this original idea of flight shame come from, and it's not what the term flight shame actually describes. So if we are to evaluate this whole thing of flight shame as a social movement, has it been a success or not? Well, we can say yes. There are several thousand people that signed these different commitments not to fly. For the 2021 campaign, I found latest numbers were nearly 10,000 signatories, of which 4,500 were from Sweden, from basically 59 different countries. We have a Swedish Facebook group that has nearly 13,000 members, and we saw a decrease of 10 to 13% in flights in Sweden and Germany in 2019. But has it really been a success? Well, I mean, that can be questioned. If we are saying that we have 4,500 or 4,600 people from Sweden roughly that committed to this, that they're going to stay flight free, and we put that in relation to the 350,000 Swedish people that go to Thailand every year, we see that this is a drop in the ocean, right? This is not something where this specific campaign, where we can attribute a huge success to this specific campaign. We can also see that this probably refers a lot, or appeals a lot, to people that are already very concerned about flying, and thus maybe gives a home or gives them a feeling of belonging, but not necessarily something that might convert a lot of people that aren't converted. And we also have to put this in relation to the 1% of super emitters when we're looking at flying that are responsible for 50% of global emissions, according to Stefan Gössling, a professor in Sweden, which basically shows that this is probably not going to change the world. If you want to look further into this topic, I would recommend you look at the research of my colleague Sarah Ullström, who's actually specifically working on it. You have a link to her page. Here are a couple of things that I cited throughout my presentation, and I guess we'll make the presentations available later on so you can follow up on these links. With that, I want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Henner, for a different perspective on how to look at environmental matters. I think we can get straight to the next point, which is our panel discussion.